Good afternoon, and welcome to the fourth webinar in the ABSAC Montana Center 2020 webinar series. This webinar is titled, When Faith Hurts, Recognizing and Responding to the Spiritual Impact of Child Abuse, presented by Victor Vieth. This webinar will be recorded. PowerPoint and the recording will be emailed to everyone after the presentation. There will be time for questions at the end. Please write your questions in the chat or Q&A function. Now, I would first like to introduce Dr. Janet Rosenzweig, Executive Director of ABSAC, to talk about becoming an ABSAC member and to tell you a little bit about Dr. Victor Vieth. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. And thank you as well to all of your colleagues at the New York Foundling who have done so much for so many, including co-sponsoring this webinar series with ABSAC. ABSAC is the acronym for the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children. Our motto is strengthening practice through knowledge, and we work to make sure that the very newest and the very best research findings are made available to all of us out there on the front lines working with individuals, families, communities, and organizations. Our webinar series, our Zoom chat series, and our online course are three ways that we've partnered with the New York Foundling to make those kinds of educational programs available for you. I also want to take a minute and remind everybody that ABSAC is very well known for our wonderful colloquia, where we bring together national experts, researchers, practitioners from all of the different disciplines working in child maltreatment for a few days of fellowship and learning. And this year, I don't say it's no different, because it will be a little bit different, but we will be having the renowned ABSAC colloquia will be taking place in New Orleans this year, September 21st to 23rd, and it'll be operated within every one of the guidelines promulgated by the Centers for Disease Control to ensure the comfort and safety of all of our presenters and our participants. We've got a wonderful line of more than 100 speakers, and for those of you that have didn't to see Victor Vieth, Victor is one of the many people, including Dr. Vince Folletti, that you'll actually have a chance to meet should you join us down in New Orleans, and we encourage you to do that. If you want to take advantage of any of ABSAC's resource, and we really hope you do, we'd like to encourage you to join ABSAC, and you can do that. The link is right on the slide on your screen, and if you do that today or within the next week, you can use the discount code ZoomChat10 for a 10% discount on membership, and that will give you the membership rate for all of our publications, all of our events, especially, again, want to mention our online course featuring more than 20 national experts, and that's being very well reviewed by the folks that are enrolled in it now. So thank you so much for joining us today on this event. We hope that you consider becoming a member of ABSAC, taking advantage of the discounts we offer for joining, and then take advantage of all of our publications and online offerings. Without further ado, I'd like to take this time and thank and introduce Victor Vieth, who's our speaker for today. Victor is a member of the board of directors of ABSAC and several other national organizations. He's currently the director of education and research for the Zero Abuse Project, known as ZAP. He gained national recognition initially for his work addressing child abuse as a prosecutor in rural Minnesota. He's the 2018 president of the Academy on Violence and Abuse and has been instrumental in implementing a 22-state and international forensic interview training programs, as well as undergraduate and graduate training programs on child maltreatment. He's written a number of books, including On This Rock, A Call to Center the Christian Response to Child Abuse on the Life and Work of Jesus. We thank Victor very, very much for all he does for children today and every day, and it's my pleasure to turn this presentation over to Victor now. Thank you, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Janet. It's good to be with you and all my friends at ABSAC and the Fondling Center. How did we get here? How did we get to the point Leslie or someone, the PowerPoint's not advancing. Thank you. How do we get to the point where we are at a prestigious webinar series from APSAC and Fondling discussing religion or spirituality? For me, the matter was crystallized 20 plus years ago. I was working for the National Center for Prosecution of Child Abuse, and I took a phone call from a prosecutor in California who said, today in our Children's Advocacy Center, we were interviewing a little girl who was sexually abused by her father. And at the end of the interview, we said, we've asked you a lot of questions. Do you have any questions for us? And the girl got nervous and twirled her hair and looked at her toes and said, yeah, I'm just sort of wondering, am I still a virgin in God's eyes? And that's a mental health question for sure. It's also a spiritual question. Well, how do we as multidisciplinary team professionals respond to a query such as that? I was so intrigued that I convened a faith-based working group of pastors, priests, rabbis, imams, frontline child protection professionals to dialogue about this. From there, I wrote a book chapter. We partnered with Augsburg College to do a study on the spiritual impact of trauma. We began to hit the books and realized how much research is out there that is often ignored in our child protection field. Eventually, we designed a course that we originally called Chaplains for Children. Today, we call it Keeping Faith, where we put faith and child protection leaders in the room together. We go through the research, we give them scenarios, and teach them how to work together for the betterment of a child. What will we do in this webinar? We'll chat about what exactly is spirituality. What does the research tell us about the impact of child maltreatment on spirituality? What are some things that an offender might do in incorporating religion into the abuse that creates a block, impairs the ability of a child to share their experience? What does the research tell us about the potential role of religion or spirituality as a source of resiliency in coping with maltreatment? And then practicalities. How do we go about addressing the spiritual needs of survivors and perhaps even offenders? And then what are the potential possibilities for collaborations between faith and child protection communities to prevent maltreatment, and where it can't be prevented, to respond with excellence? What is spirituality? It is, to some extent, in the eye of the beholder. The Oxford American Dictionary defines it as relating to religion or religious belief as opposed to material things, somehow affecting the human spirit or soul. The academic definition provided by Donald Walker, perhaps the leading researcher in this area, he defines it as a search, a request for the sacred, a private, personal, affective experience with the divine. It is a very broad concept. Most academics distinguish between religiosity, which has to do with your creeds, your specific beliefs, as opposed to spirituality, which is a broader concept, just a sense that you're connected to something larger than yourself. However, Walker and other researchers have found that in working with survivors of maltreatment, the concept of religiosity and spirituality are intermingled. You cannot easily separate one from the other. However we define it, we know it's important. In 2009, the American Psychological Association published this literature review, and in this review, they looked at 34 major studies involving more than 19,000 maltreated children. And most of the children in these studies were impacted spiritually as a result of maltreatment. Here is one study that's illustrated. Here the researchers intersected with 527 victims of child abuse. Some were beaten, some were sexually assaulted, some were emotionally abused, many all of the above, because we know from polyvictimization research that when you're abused in one way, you're often abused in multiple ways. Every single child in this study was spiritually impacted from the trauma, which manifested itself in feelings of guilt, anger, grief, despair, doubt, afraid of dying, a belief that God is unfair. What on earth are we talking about? Some years ago, I was part of a team that was retained to investigate a history of physical and sexual abuse in a Christian boarding school. And in the course of that assessment, I saw the research come to life. I interviewed a man in his 40s who said, "Do you think that God understands ACE research?" And I asked him, I said, "Tell me about that." And he said, "Well, I understand ACE research. I was beaten on this compound. I was raped on this compound. They pulled out my teeth on this compound without Novocaine. My best friends were beaten on this compound. My very best friend killed himself. So I get it," he says. "I got an ACE score through the stratosphere." And that probably explains why, as a young man, I turned to drugs and alcohol, and I couldn't control my anger very well. I loved to go into a bar and pick on a fight with the biggest person in the room. And the worst thing I did, he said, is I was driving high on drugs one day, and I crossed the divider line in the highway, and I accidentally killed somebody. So they sent me to prison for criminal vehicular homicide. Now I'm out of prison. I've cleaned up my life. I got a pretty good job, but I'm terrified of dying. Because if I die tonight, does God hold me responsible for my many sins up to and including killing someone? Or do I get a pass because of my abusive childhood? That is a spiritual injury. I talked to a woman who said she was sexually abused by a doctor on a Christian compound. And the doctor said to her, you're so lucky. You're so lucky. I could have touched sexually any child in my care, but I purposely selected you because of all the girls I'm working with, your breasts are the most developed. And she told me she developed this tremendous anger toward God because she thought God is all-knowing. So God must have known if my breasts grew early, this man would touch me sexually. So at the end of the day, she said, I'm just so mad at God. I hold God responsible. That's a spiritual injury. Although a child may be spiritually impacted, it doesn't mean they're no longer spiritual, that they've abandoned what Walker called the quest for the sacred. This study and others found that children still may pray and recount spiritual experiences. I spoke to another man in that case who said, I ain't going to do it. He said, never going to go back to church, never going to trust anybody with a collar. But every morning I get up really early and I pray, and then I read the Bible for a good hour before I go to work. And I said, tell me about that. Why do you think you do that? And he said, I don't know, Victor, you're the expert. I guess, he said, I'm searching for something. This is predictable, this is common sense, but it's nice when common sense is supported by research. When the person who abuses the child is the boy or girl's pastor, priest, rabbi, imam, Sunday school teacher, closely connected to the child's faith tradition, the impact on the child's spirituality is pronounced. In this study, they talked to men, they were all men in this study, who were clergy people convicted of sexually abusing children. And the researchers said, you're a man of God, what's going on in your brain when you're violating children? And the men said, well, you know, I'm basically a good person. I give blood to the Red Cross. I serve soup at the homeless shelter. When there's a natural disaster like a tornado, I'm among the first on the scene to help those troubled souls. And all the good things I do in my life overshadow the teeny tiny problem I have that I touch some children sexually. Some of the men in the study say, to the researchers, well, you know, God made me this way. God gave me access to these children. And, you know, it wasn't like I abused them. It was a relationship. It was good for the children. I was teaching them sex education. I brought them out of their shell. Well, these cognitive distortions were concerning enough. But then the researcher said, did you communicate these twisted ideas of yours to the children you were violating? And the answer, of course, is yes. Father Murphy, who sexually abused as many as 200 deaf and hard of hearing children at a Catholic school in Milwaukee, would take a child into the confessional. He'd sexually, he would say to the child, God has asked me to teach you sex education. Then he'd sexually abuse the child. And then he'd say, well, it happened in this holy place, the confessional. You're not allowed to talk about it. If you ever talk about it, you will surely lose the grace of God. You will surely go to hell. Would that mess you up emotionally? Would that mess you up spiritually? And sure enough, children violated this way by a person of faith, their attendance in religious activities declines, their trust in God goes down, their relationship with God, the researchers concluded, ceases to grow. Which leads to one other point. Generally speaking, the research says the spiritual impact is more pronounced depending on your age at the time of the abuse. Not quite sure where that is, but some argue, well, you're 4 or 5, every part of you, including your spirituality, your sense of the divine, is being developed. And if that's when you're violated, it's like you're stuck in a moment in time, as opposed to you're 15 or 16 or 17, and then you're violated. Perhaps you have more spirituality or religiosity in the wheelbarrow to draw upon as a buffer against the trauma. Now, of course, every child is different. You're going to have to figure out where someone may be functioning. How often does your garden variety child abuser incorporate religion into the theme of the abuse? Can't say for sure, but there are some indicators that it happens with some regularity. Gene Abel many years ago did a study on almost 4,000 convicted child molesters, and 93% of those sex offenders described themselves as religious or very religious. Christianity Today did a survey in 2010 of almost 3,000 church leaders, and 20% of them said they had at least one convicted sex offender who was part of their congregation. Now, keep in mind, most sex offenders never get caught. Jerry Sandusky was active in a Methodist church, and most of his life he would have passed a background check, and yet now we know he is a serial sexual predator. So this is probably just the tip of the iceberg. This study found that sex offenders who grew up inside the church were the most successful in accumulating victims, large numbers of victims, and getting away with it for a long period of time. Why might that be? Well, sex offenders themselves have said to researchers and clinicians, "Are you kidding me? Going to church is the safest place for me to operate." And it's not like the old days. You could go to the YMCA or the Boy Scouts or any number of youth serving organizations, and they didn't necessarily have good child protection policies or training. But still, in many communities, particularly Protestant communities, they don't even have policies. If they do, they're terrible policies. And even if they have good policies, they don't accompany it with training. And without training, I can always get around the policy. And some sex offenders say to clinicians and others, "Oh, these church people, they're so gullible. They'll accept just about anything that you say, and they will freely, easily give you access to children." I'm not saying that. Sex offenders are saying that over and over and over again. You don't even have to look at the research, though. Just use your Google engine, and you'll see these dynamics repeat themselves in news accounts of abuse. I mentioned Father Murphy. The New York Times did a series of articles of his violation of children. HBO did a documentary called Mea Maxima Culpa, if you're interested. This is not a Catholic problem. This is in every faith tradition. Whatever your faith tradition is, if you share it with me, I guarantee you I've consulted on a case of abuse within your tradition. I'm a Lutheran, so let me pick on my Lutheran tradition. Ralph Underwager is now deceased. He used to be a mental health provider. He is also an ordained Lutheran minister. And he and his wife gave an interview in the Journal of Pedophilia, which to my knowledge no longer exists, but it was a scholarly journal to try to convince people pedophilia is not necessarily wrong. And in that interview, he made a statement to the effect, or on the screen, he says, pedophiles have to be more positive, make the claim pedophilia is an acceptable expression of God's will for love and unity among human beings. Now, I'll let folks speculate why he may have said that, but here's my point. He said it, and it was in a journal for child molesters, and how many of those sex offenders read this and used it as justification, religious justification for violating children. Here's another example, this from the Protestant community. Jack Scapp is in prison for sexually abusing a child in his congregation. He violated her in 3 different states, which is why it became a federal crime. And as the government investigated, they discovered how he incorporated religion into the abuse of his victim. The victim, according to probation sentencing report, was particularly vulnerable to abuse because of her mental condition at the time. Scapp in the church saw an email describing this girl as frightened, confused, emotionally traumatized, engaging in self-destructive behaviors. Do you think this is the sort of child that an offender would be interested in? Absolutely. Offenders will violate any child, but the easiest target is often the prey they select at first glance. The email goes on to describe the child as having a tender heart, but being teachable and moldable. So Scapp springs into action. He begins to counsel her. And in counseling, he learns that she had an emotional breakup with a boyfriend that she thought was the cat's meow and probably had her whole life planned out. We're going to get married and have kids and a picket fence and 2.5 children and a dog named Pancake. I had a dog named Pancake, so I just threw that in. But then she finds that he's not the best boy, and it's a traumatic breakup. And she shares this with Scapp, and then the pastor transitions from being her friend to a child molester and sexually abusing her in 3 different states. Here is one of the letters the government discovered that Scapp wrote his victim. He writes, "You opened your heart wide to me. You made me more than a pastor. You made me your friend, your confidant. In our fantasy talk, you have affectionately spoken of being my wife. Oh, that is exactly what Christ desires for us. He wants to marry us and become eternal lovers. I tried to craftily catch your heart. Thank you for the privilege of helping a struggling teenager. Such a wonderful life ahead of you. I must be careful not to spoil that with my selfish fantasy desires. When we get scared, Jesus sends his Spirit to live within us. I must follow the example of Christ. I have espoused you to him as a chaste virgin. This is a letter the victim wrote to Scap. She said, I was in love with you. I wouldn't admit that I was a victim. I felt so guilty, partially responsible. Maybe it was my fault. Exactly what the spiritual injury research is finding. Then I became really angry toward God. Again, exactly what the research is telling us happens. For a second, I didn't believe in God. Again, what the research is telling us often happens. I thought there can't be a God because he wouldn't let it happen. And if there is a God, I hate him because he let it happen, because you, Pastor Scap, told me God was okay with this. And in a letter to the judge, she writes, my entire life, the church had been my universe. Growing up, I watched Scap in church. I listened to his sermons 3 times a week. I was raised by my parents and my teachers to trust and obey my pastor. He was a celebrity to me, a father figure, a man of God. I felt most safe when I was in church. I first met Scap when I was in kindergarten, and I still had my baby teeth. As my pastor, I sought guidance. He told me to confide in him. He told me I was special, that he loved me, that he wanted to marry me. Exactly what the study on religious sex offenders tells us is a common dynamic. He told me I was his precious gift from God. He made me believe what we were doing was okay and right in the eyes of God. I felt so special when he texted me from the holy altar during his sermons. What are we going to do about cases like this? Well, for starters, all of us who work in this field have to be aware of the potential for spiritual injuries that may impair the ability of a child to share his or her experience of maltreatment. So in those initial reports that cross our desk, we should look for clues. Look for potential clues. So I consulted on a case in Florida where in a Christian school, a child didn't come back from recess or whatever the activity was. A teacher goes and finds her in a bathroom and she's crying. And the teacher asks her what's wrong. And she says, I think God's really mad at me. Teacher asks a few more questions and she shares that she was sexually abused by a male teacher in that Christian school. And that's what comes in as a mandated report. Well, from that clue, it happened in a religious setting. The child in her outcry says, I think God is mad at me. I already have clues going into the forensic interview that there could be spiritual injury, spiritual blocks. Also look at the setting for the abuse. Is the alleged offender a clergy person, or did it happen in a faith-based institution? That will increase the chance that religion was incorporated into the abuse or that the child has spiritual questions. Do we know anything about the child's belief system? Small towns here may have an advantage over larger communities. Some years ago, I got a call from detectives and they said, hey, we saw your workshop on spiritual injuries. We think we got one of those cases. And I said, sure, tell me what's going on. And they said, well, we've got this very charismatic preacher, and apparently on Sunday, he gave a really emotional sermon about confessing sins. Then he played emotional music, and he asked everybody to stand up and confess a sin. And this one man stood up and began to cry, and he said, I have been touching sexually all of my children. And then the pastor turned to the victims and said, now you stand up and confess your role in this sexual activity. Then he pronounced God's forgiveness on everybody and said, nobody in the congregation is allowed to talk about it. If you do, you will surely lose the grace of God. Surely you will go to hell. Well, fortunately, a few people in the church got out into the parking lot, had the heebie-jeebies, and they said, I don't know about you, but I'm driving to the police station. So they go to the police station and share what happened that morning, and they said, hey, before you talk to the victims, just want you to know the pastor told them they'll go to hell if they talk to you. Hey, good luck, detectives. We're on our way for Perkins. Stop by if you need anything else. So the detectives call me, and at the end of the day, this is what we did. Normally, you start your investigation with the forensic interview, but that's just the norm. There are exceptions to every rule. In this case, they started backwards by talking to the suspect, getting him to confess. It was going to be easy. They already had 5 people who are witnesses to his confession. So they get a confession from him. Then they go to the pastor and say, hey, 6 people overheard this. He himself has confessed to us. We're going to talk to the children now, but it's our understanding you told them not to cooperate. I just want to show you the criminal law in our state about being an accessory after the fact and tampering with witnesses. I don't know what the prosecutor is going to do, but maybe you want to take it all back and allow us to share with these children that you just flat out screwed up this morning. And of course, they can talk to us. And the pastor backed down. And so they shared that with the children, and the children now felt comforted, free to talk, and then shared their history of sexual abuse. Select an appropriate setting for the forensic interview. Sometimes we do have to do emergency first response interviews just to see if someone should be taken into protective custody. Ideally, we want to talk to kids in a CAC, but if it's an emergency interview, be cognizant of the room you're in. If the child was abused with a religious leader incorporating religious themes, and there's religious trappings in, say, a faith-based school, that could be an impairment. That could be a block. For instance, I know of a child who the perpetrator said, hey, you just focus on the cross. He would touch her genitals until she had an orgasm, and he would say to her, you just focus on the cross on the wall, and this will be over. And she said, you know, to this day, she can't look at a cross without having it trigger really painful memories and cause her to freeze up. So something as innocent as wearing a cross necklace while you do a forensic interview could be a block for a child abused in a religious setting. There's a case in Pennsylvania I'm familiar with where during the forensic interview, the child says, yeah, my daddy, he does that sex to me, and Mr. Jesus, he was in the room just watching me, and he didn't stop it. He didn't stop it at all. And it turns out in her bedroom, there was a picture of Jesus on her wall, and she'd be staring at Jesus, praying in her mind, Jesus, come out of the picture, Jesus, stop Dad from hurting me, but Jesus never did. So could you imagine doing an emergency interview at, say, her faith-based school, and there's a picture of Christ on the wall? That could be a block given the dynamics of her abuse. So we need to be aware of those possibilities. Be aware of spiritual blocks showing up in the interview itself. The case I started out with where the girl in California said to the interviewer, am I still a virgin in God's eyes? I know of another case in Pennsylvania where during the interview, the child says, yeah, Dad would tuck me into bed, we'd say our prayers together and ask for God's protection, and then Dad would abuse me. And then as soon as the abuse was over, Dad said, see, God's okay with this because we just asked for God's protection, but he didn't stop me from touching you. So God has approved of what we're doing. So it may literally come out during the interview itself. So how do we respond when these issues arise? I think we offer the child reassurance. You're not in trouble with me, which may sound like nothing, but if you're a boy or girl and you're abused in a religious theme and you're told you're in trouble with God and in trouble with the church or synagogue if you make an outcry, and now all of a sudden an interviewer says, you're not in trouble with me, I've never been in that situation before. I think I want to talk with this person longer. This is a safe place. You can't promise them it's going to be safe when they leave the interview room, when they go back home, when they go back to their faith community. You can't promise that, but you can promise them this is a safe place. This interview room, this Children's Advocacy Center, this is a safe place. And that may cause a child to want to stay in that room a little bit longer as you explore what happened in their life. You know, I talk to lots of boys. I talk to lots of girls. No matter what happened, it's not your fault. If they have been told that they are in trouble, not only with their parents, but with their church, with their God, and all of a sudden you're saying, no matter what happened, it's not your fault, that could be a means to remove a barrier. If the child asks a spiritual question during the forensic interview, I think we should decline to answer. So if that child says, am I still a virgin in God's eyes? Ask the question back. You'll generate more information, more potential evidence. Tell me about that. What leads you to ask that question? And maybe the child will share with you additional details of the abuse or religious themes incorporated, and probably the child won't persist in asking the question. If they do persist, I would simply say, you know what? That's a really important question, but I'm not sure I'm the best person to sort that out with you, but I promise you, someone will begin as soon as today to sit down with you and begin to process these questions, and then a mental health provider, hopefully somebody trained on spiritual injury research, can begin to work that through. My concern is if you just plow ahead, A, you're not a theologian, B, you're not a mental health provider, and these are very complicated mental health and spiritual injury questions that it's better to turn those over to a provider so that you don't unwittingly say something insensitive or even harmful. So how then do we pass that baton to our MDT and help a child process questions like, am I still a virgin in God's eyes? Well, just as we bring to the case review team the medical needs, the physical needs of the child, and the emotional needs of the child, we can also bring to the team spiritual questions or spiritual needs that the child is addressing. Do we have a therapist who is well-trained in cognitive behavioral and other evidence-based approaches, but who is also fluent with the research on spiritual injuries and has a good sense of how to explore these issues? If you don't have somebody well-trained, that's okay, but what is our game plan to get them caught up to speed? Perhaps have one or more members of a faith community as part of your case review team. They can help you explore dynamics in various religious cultures in your community, and they may be a conduit for accessing helpful services. When you think about this, although it's new and novel for child protection leaders, it's not really new and novel in the world of trauma-informed care. I'm a survivor of cancer, and when I was diagnosed with cancer, my medical provider says, would you like to speak to one of our chaplains? Our chaplains are well-trained to help folks who've just received a life-threatening diagnosis. And I declined. I just wanted to go home and talk to my wife. But it was a very kind offer. Doctors do this all the time because they have learned that spirituality can be a source of resilience and comfort when you've endured trauma or have a difficult diagnosis. This is why the military and law enforcement and fire departments have chaplains for those who work in trauma arenas. We know it can play a role. Well, why on earth would we deny a child abuse victim similar services if they could be helpful? Consider the clergy person as a potential support person for the child, the potentiality of prayer as a source of resiliency before trial. That same girl who said, am I still a virgin in God's eyes, walking into the courtroom that day with the prosecutor, tugged on the skirt of the prosecutor and said, Miss Kathy, can we say a prayer before we go into court? Well, how should you respond to that? I hope you all agree the answer should be yes. But you, the prosecutor, shouldn't lead the prayer. You don't know what is in this child's heart. She should lead the prayer. And that's what happened. And the girl said, dear God, please don't let that defense attorney yell at me like he did at that other hearing. Well, now, armed with that information, the prosecutor can be the answer to the child's prayer. So she approaches the bench, shares what happened. The defense attorney feels very bad. He wasn't trying to frighten the child at another hearing. He just has a loud voice. And he says, oh, I'm so sorry. I'll lower my voice. And the judge says, well, that sounds like a good game plan. Child testifies, case ends up in a conviction. And probably to this day, the child thinks that God answered her prayer. The prosecutor thinks that she was the answer. The judge and the defense attorney think they were the answer. And perhaps in a mysterious way, all those forces came together to help that girl. But it begins with a sensitivity to these issues. What does the research tell us about the potential benefit of spiritual care for a child abuse victim? There's quite a bit of research saying that spirituality can play a positive role in helping a child cope. And you see on the screen one of those studies. Here are additional studies saying that those child abuse victims who maintain some healthy level of spirituality, they do a whole lot better than those who are not able to turn to their spirituality to cope. They still may have the impact of a high ACE score, but the impact is muted or mitigated because spirituality is a significant source of resiliency. This was the finding of this Johns Hopkins study, for example, where a number of survivors, even without meaningful medical and mental health involvement, if they could rely on their spirituality in a healthy way, it was mitigating the impact of a high ACE score. This was a study published, I believe, in December of 2019. Dr. Ernest Jurels of Southern Methodist University did a study at a major children's advocacy center in the United States on adolescents who had been sexually abused. And he concluded that spirituality was perhaps the most important source of resiliency in determining the well-being of these children. Not directly involving studies on maltreated children, but there's a huge body of research saying a healthy sense of spirituality can have a positive influence on our medical health, which again is perhaps why hospitals routinely have chaplains, because they do realize it can play a role in our medical and mental health. The American Psychological Association has recognized the importance of this issue, and they have published not one but 2 treatises for clinicians to use to incorporate a means of addressing the potential spiritual impact of trauma. And in these books, they talk about the value of story for many child abuse victims. So being able to turn to their sacred text, whatever their religious tradition is, and finding a healthy story that could assist them in coping. I'll give you one example from my Lutheran community. I talked to a mental health provider who said, look, I'm counseling this woman who's in her 40s, and she grew up in the Lutheran church, and she tells me she knows she's going to go to hell. She absolutely knows she's going to go to hell, and there's nothing that we can do to avert that. So I asked her to tell me more, and she said, well, grew up in an Orthodox conservative Lutheran community, and in the Lutheran tradition, you don't typically take communion until you're 13 and you're confirmed. And the reason for that is there's a passage in the writings of Paul saying you got to take this seriously. It's the body and blood of Christ here. We're not dealing with Kool-Aid and crackers. And so if you're not careful, you don't discern what you're doing, you could be eating and drinking to your own judgment. So she grew up in that tradition. And she said throughout her childhood, her father said, you know, as soon as you're 13 and you're confirmed, you start to take communion, I won't sexually touch you anymore, because then Jesus will be inside you and I won't violate God. On the eve of her first communion, her dad rapes her one more time. And then after the abuse is over, she says, Father, this is the last time, right? Because you always told me when I start to take communion, you won't touch me sexually anymore. And her father gives her an evil laugh and says, honey, there ain't no God. I don't believe any of that stuff, but I knew you did. And so I thought that would keep you quiet all these years. Honey, this will stop when I no longer desire you. The next morning, she takes her first communion, and consistent with the spiritual injury research, she is filled with anger toward God. And so she says to her therapist, I spit in the communion cup when I'm chewing the wafer. I'm chewing it up, and in my brain, I say, I hate you, God. I'm chewing you up right now, Jesus. And in an hour, I'm going to poop you into the toilet and flush you the blank out of my life. Now fast forward, she's in her 40s, and she's terrified. She's convinced herself she is going to go to hell. Well, Dr. Donald Walker and others have found the answer to bad theology is good theology. The answer to a bad story is good story. So in that case, the mental health provider worked with a trauma-informed Lutheran pastor who'd been trained by us, and he was able to work with the victim and say, all right, well, let's look at these sacred texts together. Let's look at the story of the crucifixion of Jesus. What was going on there? Well, Roman soldiers were spitting on Jesus and beating Jesus and torturing Jesus to death on a cross. And what did Jesus say? Forgive them, God, forgive them. They just don't know what they're doing. And then the pastor said, what do you think about that? If Jesus could forgive those soldiers torturing his body to death, do you think he could forgive you for spitting in a communion cup, or what you were thinking when you chewed the wafer? Things like that, Walker and other researchers have found can be extremely helpful if properly applied. This article published by the American Psychological Association says there's quite a bit of room for collaboration between faith and mental health providers. The clergy could be a consultant to the mental health provider, exactly the case I just shared with you. The therapist could be a consultant to the faith leader. Your pastor, priest, rabbi, imam may not know anything about suicidal ideations. They may not know what to say, what to do, what referrals to make if they are working with a teenager engaging in cutting behavior, for example. So having that mental health provider you can reach out to and say, what do I do now? What referral do I make? What do I do to make sure that nobody gets harmed? Could be extremely valuable. Each side should have a really good list of referrals. So we need to work toward a community where the therapists in our Children's Advocacy Center, they know who are the trauma-informed faith leaders in their community. And those faith leaders need to know who are the trauma-informed therapists in my community that I can make a referral to. And how do I make sure that we are collaborating together if we are both working with a victim? Limited collaboration, even full collaboration. I know folks where they've needed medical care, mental health care, and spiritual care, and they sign a release so all of these providers can tag team and be on the same page. And no less an authority than the American Psychological Association in some of their publications has said that's the direction we need to move for many victims. Donald Walker, who was the lead editor on the 2 APA books, he says, for many victims, the answer to a bad story, the answer to bad theology is good theology, and good theology can powerfully undo twisted theological constructs. I consulted on a case in the Baptist community where a father was also a Baptist minister, and after he sexually abused his little girl, the child said, "Dad, this is wrong, it's sinful, I don't think this should be happening." And her father said, "Well, it's normally sinful, but there are exceptions in the Bible." And he opens the Bible to the account in Genesis of the creation of the world. And he says, "Look at here, honey. When it was just Adam and Eve, God used incest to populate the world. And after the great flood, it was just Noah and his family. And again, God turned to incest to populate the world." And you know how often in the Bible, God comes to us in a dream. Well, God has come to me in a dream. And he has said that I need to prepare you to be a young mother because he's going to rebuild his church. And I don't want to touch you sexually, but God says I have to do it to prepare you to be a young mother in a few years. Walker found in his research, his analysis, a bad story could be replaced with a good story. So in a scenario like that, a trauma-informed faith leader could say, well, let's look at a story together today. Let's look at how the devil tempted Jesus in the wilderness. What did the devil use to tempt? Oh, yeah, he was quoting scripture, right? So what do you make of that? What do you see of that? Oh, I guess not everybody quoting the Bible is necessarily representing God. And what did Jesus say in response? Well, he put those verses into context. He used better scriptural passages, more on point scriptural passages. So let's do the same thing today. What does God say about child abuse? What does Jesus say about child abuse? And then find healthy stories to undo the toxic theological constructs from a perpetrator. So many survivors struggle with the why question. Why did this happen to me? Why didn't God answer my prayers? This peer-reviewed a chapter in one of the APA books says, well, the account of Job could be helpful in spiritual care because Job suffered unjustly and he too lamented, "Where are you, God? What's going on here? Why aren't you helping me?" And God says, "God, you're not. My ways are not your ways. We can't answer for you this why question. Well, let's talk about the how question. How do we get through it together?" So many survivors, like the girl who spit in the communion cup, think God must be mad at them because I was so angry at God. He or she, however you define God, is going to be upset with me. Well, in the account of Job, Job was pretty ticked at God too. And yet what does God say? He says, "Job is my righteous friend. You religious leaders, you're the ones I'm upset with. You don't get it." So apparently God is big enough to take our anger and not hold us accountable for it. Diane Langberg, a PhD psychologist who has written a number of books on the spiritual care of survivors, says, look, one of the basic functions of the church that we often forget is the art of lament. And so for many survivors who say, I want to pray again, I want to read my sacred text again, but I don't know where to begin, she will often refer them to the Psalms or the prophets where people are angry at God and speaking about the injustice of the cruelties inflicted on them. Jeremiah says to the religious leaders of his day, you know, you're all shining clean on the outside. You walk into the temple. You think we all should revere you, but God sees the blood on your hands. God sees what you do in the dark of the night. A passage like that could be really powerful by somebody abused by a religious leader, and that religious community rallies around the offender, because Jeremiah says God stands with the victim, and God is outraged at those who misuse God's name to hurt somebody. Some recommendations for faith leaders. I say to faith leaders, you got to understand ACE research because a lot of times you're dealing with somebody with drug and alcohol problems, promiscuous behavior, whatever the issues may be, and you're just thinking these are sins and you're coming down on them hard, and really you're treating the smoke, ignoring the underlying fire. These are often symptoms of trauma. You need to work with the victim to access appropriate medical and mental health care. Faith leaders need to stay within their lane. They should focus only on the spiritual questions and coordinate that work with the medical and mental health providers. So many survivors of abuse have said, I hate it. I go to my faith leader, they give me a platitude, a prayer, a Bible verse, and they think that's supposed to fix me. I need somebody to walk the dark valley and to understand there's going to be ups and downs and we may never get to a point of true healing. I need somebody to walk with me, to go the distance with me. We need to teach faith leaders that basic concept of trauma. So many faith leaders right away go to the point of forgiveness. So when we educate them, we say, when you do that, you sound an awful lot like the perpetrator. Because the perpetrator is often saying to their victim, you got to forgive. God says you got to forgive. And now when you as a faith leader go to that point, you sound just like the perpetrator. Instead, let's talk about justice. Let's talk about mercy. Let's talk about righteous indignation. Forgiveness is a gift of God. It'll come on its own if it comes at all. And then sometimes a victim will say, I want to talk to mom or dad who abused me. And then we need to educate our faith leaders that you got to be really cautious there and say to the victim, you should sort through the pros and cons of that with your mental health provider. It may not go the way that you want to. Martin Moran was sexually abused at a summer religious camp. And in his memoirs, The Tricky Party, describes going and tracking down this man in a nursing home, if my memory's right. And the man admits sexually abusing Moran, but he says, don't you remember what you were like back then? You were stuttering, you were awkward. Me touching you sexually got you out of your shell. Do you honestly think you'd be this famous actor today if I hadn't touched you sexually? And Martin Moran writes in his memoirs, I'm driving away and I'm thinking, is that right? Is the reason I became a famous actor because this guy touched me sexually? So even if the offender admits the abuse, they still have cognitive distortions to justify their crimes. It's probably not going to go the way the victim wants it to go. So we need to educate faith leaders so they don't send the victim down a really hurtful path. If the victim's still going to go ahead with such a meeting and they're an adult and you can't stop it, then figure out a game plan. The mental health provider, the faith leader should be there. There should be some rules going in to such a conversation, and somebody should be able to stop the meeting when it's truly harmful to the victim, and most importantly, be there to help them process their feelings after that. Kelly Clark is now deceased, but he used to sue a lot of churches, and he wrote a law review article saying none of my clients wanted to sue you. They just wanted you to act like godly people. They wanted you to apologize with no ands, ifs, or buts. They often wanted symbolic gestures. One set of victims wanted a rock garden at the church where they were abused, but the church said no, because then everybody who looks at this rock garden as a healing place for survivors will know we had a child molester in our employment at one time. So we can't do that. So the victims go to a lawyer, and the lawyer says, yeah, I think a $7.5 million judgment will soften them up. The rock garden would have been a cheaper and better and more holy response. They want true changes in policies. They don't want churches to rewrite the history if abuse took place. And then they often want practical things. I consulted with a minister once who said to me, yeah, we got this woman who was sexually abused by a youth minister 20-some years ago. It's no doubt it happened. He went to prison. But now she's come to us and said she has a new job and her new insurance won't cover medications she really needs to control some of her dangerous behaviors. And we could actually cover it pretty easily, but our church lawyer says don't do it because that'll be an admission of liability and she's going to turn around and sue us. So the pastor calls me and says, what do you think, Victor? And I paused for a minute and I said, what's the name of your church again? And the pastor said, First Christian something something. And I said, I guess I would just focus on the word Christian, because what I hear is that your guy sexually abused her. Your guy has caused these major problems in her life, and you could easily help her with legitimate medical needs. And you're talking to lawyers? Look, just be a Christian, just be a kind person, and she's not going to turn around and sue you. Churches that get sued, it's because they don't act like Christians or Jews or Muslims, whatever your faith tradition is. They act cruelly. Be a kind person and she won't sue you. Listen and act. I know a minister who was talking to a woman on a subway in Baltimore, and she says, yeah, I'd like to go back to, let me back up, it's a different account. There was a woman who was very faithful in her church attendance. Then one day she stopped. So the pastor visits her at her house and says, Martha, you've been pretty faithful for 20 years, and now we haven't seen you for a month. I just want to know if anything's going on I could help you with. And she says, well, you played a certain hymn. And the pastor says, tell me about that. And she says, well, I joined this church so many decades ago because I looked at your hymnal and you don't have a song that my dad used to hum to me when he sexually abused me as a girl. And then out of the blue, you put it up on the PowerPoint a few weeks ago, and that was the hymn my dad used to hum to me when he violated me. And it was all I could do to not break down in church. And I got out quickly, and I got home, and I fell apart, and I cried 3 days solid. I can't go back to church and run the risk you play that hymn again. Pastor said, thanks for sharing that. I promise, as long as I'm pastor, we'll never play that hymn again. It's just dialoguing with your survivors and figuring out what you can do to help them reconnect to their faith traditions. I'm a graduate of seminary, Wartburg Theological Seminary, and my pastoral care professor wrote this on the board one day, and I thought this was brilliant. He says, so many times you just don't know what to say and don't know what to do with those who've endured trauma, and their needs are so great. So he would often say then to someone, you know, I don't know what to say, I don't know what to do, but I'm going to stick with you until we figure it out together. What's the first thing you need? Let's figure that out together. What's the next thing you need? And I'm going to stick with you as long as it takes. You are no longer alone. How would you meet the needs of an offender like Jerry Sandusky at Penn State, who was active in his Methodist church? One victim told me he actually took victims to church sometimes. Well, we need to educate faith leaders that you're not qualified to be working with a guy like Sandusky. You're not a sex offender treatment provider. So you're going to need him to sign a release so you can talk to his treatment provider, learn as much as you can about his cognitive distortions, stay within your lane, review the original records because they are lying to you, they are deceiving you. So the more information you have, the better off you are. You do have a moral obligation to confront cognitive distortions. So I consulted with a Lutheran minister who was providing pastoral care to another Lutheran minister who was in prison for sexually abusing children in the congregation. And the pastoral care provider calls me one day and says, I'm at wit's end. This guy admits sexually abusing girls in the congregation, but he's got all these excuses. And one of his excuses is, well, you know, the Apostle Paul said, don't withhold yourself sexually from your marriage partner. But my wife did that, and so she was sinning, and her sin naturally then triggered my sin because I had legitimate needs for intimacy. So because of my wife's sin, I was touching adolescent girls sexually. It's my wife's sin that really sent me here to prison. And the pastoral care provider was confronting him and saying, oh, no, look at the fall of humankind in Garden of Eden. God didn't allow Adam to blame Eve. Eve wasn't allowed to blame Adam. Nobody was allowed to blame the snake. Everybody was responsible for their own misconduct. But whatever the pastoral care provider did, the perpetrator had a new theological construct. So finally I said to the pastor, why are you giving the guy communion? It is a sacred rite in the Lutheran tradition. So maybe stop throwing pearls before swine and soften him up a little bit. And that's exactly what he did. He said, I cannot assure you anymore that you are in the grace of God. You show no remorse, no true repentance. And that shook up the offender to the point where eventually he was saying all the right things. And his treatment provider reached out to the pastor and said, I don't know what you're doing, but he's a changed man in treatment these days. Did it actually change the person's heart? Nobody will ever know that. But certainly the pastor was doing the right thing by showing some tough love and coordinating his approach with the treatment provider. This comes up in religious communities. If I'm a religious leader, do I have to keep the confidence of a sex offender? The law review article on the left you can find online. And it says that courts typically defer to the religious leader. Do you have to keep this confidence or not? And the good news is virtually every faith tradition, including Catholicism, where we often think there's no end runs around the confessional, more often than not, they are finding a way within their faith tradition to still make a report, to still testify against an offender if need be. And I wrote the theological article on the right in my Lutheran tradition saying in the Lutheran community, there's absolutely no right of confidence in counseling a sex offender if doing so would endanger the life of a child or another human being. Here's another area for collaboration between CACs and faith communities. I just yesterday took a call from a faith leader in Louisiana who's got a convicted sex offender in the congregation and has no idea, how do I manage this person safely? We can walk them through that. We can get them good resources. The resource on the left is an extraordinary book by two great child protection professionals and two great faith leaders, one in the Christian, one in the Jewish community. Both have worked extensively in child protection. And there's a whole chapter in there on how do you manage sex offenders. Aleinu, a great campaign from Sacred Spaces about standardizing policies in Jewish communities, can also walk you through what policies you should have in place if you have somebody in your congregation who is a convicted sex offender. This study was published in 2017, a qualitative study, but it documented how often in children's advocacy centers, forensic interviews, and MDT investigations, children are raising spiritual questions, such as, am I still a virgin in God's eyes? And they called for better collaborations between faith and child protection communities. We have to educate faith leaders about trauma and how to respond appropriately. We have to educate CACs and child protection professionals about the research on spiritual care and its importance to many victims, and we need to teach these communities to work together. This is very consistent with the cultural competency standards of the National Children's Alliance. To meet those standards, you must be sensitive to the cultures of the children in your community, including their religious heritage. I mentioned at the outset, we designed, while we were still part of a healthcare system, a program called Chaplains for Children. Now we call it Keeping Faith. We've now converted it virtually. The next offering will be in July if you're interested. But we get CACs and child protection folks and faith communities into the same room, and we go through the research, we go through scenarios, we get them in small groups practicing how do we work together to coordinate our responses to the needs of these children that we are both encountering. And we're working with a couple of researchers from Pepperdine to document the efficacy of that program. We argued that there is a role for a trauma-informed chaplain on a CAC case review team, and 3 CACs have actually hired a full-time chaplain. The first was Greenville, South Carolina. Her name is Carrie Netto. She used to be a hospital chaplain working in pediatric units, so she already had great skills working with children who've endured trauma. She then went through our Keeping Faith training. She connected with Shauna Galloway Williams, the executive director of the CAC in South Carolina. They hired her as a victim advocate and chaplain. She sits on the case review team, and when there are spiritual questions, she is a resource. It's not obligatory, but last year, 535 children and adults asked for the chaplaincy services through the CAC. And then she also has a role educating all of the faith leaders in Greenville what trauma-informed spiritual care looks like, and how do you coordinate that with the medical and mental health providers at the CAC. So when she has to pass the baton, when a child is no longer working with her, let's say the child's Catholic or Jewish or Muslim, whatever the tradition is, she doesn't refer the child to any old priest or any old pastor or any old imam, but somebody she knows is trauma-informed and will sensitively respond to the child's needs. Mississippi has brought Chaplains for Children training at a very high level in their state, as have some other communities. The faith community can play a big role in prevention. So if we educate the faith community about the CDC standards for best practices for youth-serving organizations, we can take them to a much higher level. We can also do creative programs like HALOS, which began in Charleston. Churches, synagogues partner with faith leaders, and then if there's a child abuse victim who has a need the government can't provide, the government shares that with the HALOS project. Let's say a child needs a dress for prom. She's in foster care. She doesn't have the money for that. It's not the sort of thing the government will pay for. But the social worker explains the situation to HALOS. They send out an email to their partner saying, hey, we need a prom dress for this child, and 100% of those needs have been met through HALOS and other programs like it, such as Care in Action in Minnesota. The Office of Victims of Crime has recognized that as a promising practice, and they actually have a downloadable kit to explore that. You can also reach out to me, and I can connect you with folks who've implemented that stellar partnership. Resources for you before we finish up and take your questions. Faith Trust Institute, their website has a ton of great resources on diverse faith traditions that you might be able to employ. If you're working in the Jewish community, I'm on the board of directors of Sacred Spaces that has done just extraordinarily pioneering things in the Jewish community. They have an extraordinary campaign called Aleinu I urge you to check out. I'm also on the board of directors of Grace, Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. They have extraordinary resources for you as well. What does the future hold on this particular topic? Well, the reason I went to seminary and graduated in 2017 is I have seen for 30 years of my career the intersection between religion and child abuse. I've seen religion as bad as can be in child abuse cases and as good as can be in child abuse cases. And I'd like to, before I die, have less of the latter and a whole lot more of the former. So I went to seminary, I worked with Wartburg. They helped me design a course of study to focus as much as I can on the spiritual impact of child maltreatment. Here you see me on graduation day. And so I've written a lot about these issues for both the secular and faith community. I wrote this law review article. You can find open access online, Wounded Souls, about the spiritual impact of trauma and how faith and CPS and other MDT professionals can work together. I also co-edited this special seminary issue about coordinating medical and mental health in spiritual care, and a whole series of really pioneering articles. And all of these articles are also online, published through the Journal of Currents in Mission and Theology. You can find it all open access, amazing resources. This was my seminary thesis. Janet mentioned it at the outset, where I analyzed the sacred text. What did Jesus say about child abuse? How did the early church respond? And what would it mean if the faith community took Jesus seriously in the Christian context? And my belief had always been, if we can engage the faith community theologically, everything else will fall into place. And I hope eventually we'll have research to show that, but anecdotally, it sure looks promising. The Southern Baptist Convention is the largest Protestant denomination in the United States, 15 million members. And if you follow the news, you know they've been struggling with sexual abuse scandals in that church body. So they had this commission do this comprehensive report. The commissioners contacted me. They interviewed me. And when the report came down, it was my seminary thesis that they were citing most often, and saying, we got to do this. We're not Christians if we don't engage in this at a high level. That's pretty powerful anecdotal evidence that if you engage a faith community theologically, playing in their ball field, then everything else will fall into place. And you can do this, I think, in all faith traditions. Marcia Bunge, a friend of mine from Gustavus Adolphus, was a co-editor of this book where she looked at sacred texts of the 6 most prominent religions in the world, just what those sacred texts say about children. Child Abuse and Neglect in 2014 did a great series of articles, and they had faith leaders of different faith traditions talking about what their sacred texts say about protecting children from abuse, and a number of articles about the positive role religion can play in addressing child abuse. One more example here. I wrote an article, a theological article, on why we don't have to hit children anymore. And that's a big deal in some conservative Protestant communities. But I played in their ball field and said, from these sacred texts, we can put down the board, we can put down the stick. We don't have to do it anymore. And then I worked with the Academy on Violence and Abuse. I worked with APSAC. We published some articles for the secular world about how you can be culturally sensitive working with a parent who is hitting their child, how you can work within their culture to help them see they don't have to hit the child anymore, and they can still call themselves a person of God. And 2 studies from Pepperdine University, based on an original writing of mine, has said it does seem to work. When we take very conservative Protestants, we just show them the research on corporal punishment. It doesn't make a tinker's darn worth of difference. If we, though, give them a religious lecture showing them how in these sacred texts they don't have to hit children anymore, and then we combine that theological lesson with the research on corporal punishment, their attitude changes dramatically. And we're continuing to work with Cindy and Robin Miller-Perrin, and I think we're going to have more studies in the next few years that are even more hopeful that theological engagement, combining that with what we know to be best practice, causes huge changes for the better. And Langbert says the bottom line for a lot of survivors of abuse is, you can make sense of sexual abuse and know God, or God and no sexual abuse, but how on earth do you tolerate the 2 realities together? This quote from Bonhoeffer, Lutheran minister executed by the Nazis because of his opposition to the government. He said, "Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. Not to act is to act." A couple minutes over time, but I hope we're still good, Lana and Janet, and I'm happy now to answer any questions that you may have.
Hey, Victor, thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
I can, yep.
Okay, great. So thank you all for staying. I know some people had to head out, but everybody will be getting a recording of the entire webinar. So if you have to leave, you'll get everything later. We did have a couple of questions, so if you can stay a little bit, I'll give those questions to you.
Yes.
But one question we received was, how do you keep from alienating children from one religious background when you have a CAC member from another religious background? So how do you work on that with the two different backgrounds, or somebody maybe not be religious at all?
Well, it should never be about you. It should be about the child. So it's not about promoting religion or any particular worldview. It's about being culturally sensitive. So the reason some CACs have implemented chaplaincy services is a chaplain is very different from a pastor, a priest, or a rabbi. They are not reflecting any particular faith tradition. They are reflecting the tradition of the child that they're working with, or the child may have no religious heritage. They may just simply have a spiritual conundrum that they're searching with as they try to make meaning out of their suffering, and then you go with wherever the child or the adult survivor is. It's probably why you wouldn't want a chaplain who is not ecumenical, who doesn't understand their unique role if they're serving on a case review team or in the employment of a CAC. It's a great question. I remember I was training once on this topic, and there was a PhD psychologist who came up to me and said, I'm not going to do it. I hate religion. I agree with Freud that it's just a source of mental illness, and as soon as we get rid of religion, the better off we're going to be. So I don't care what a child says to me. I ain't ever going to go there. I think that attitude's pretty darn dangerous, because then it is all about you. And it shouldn't be about you. It should be about the child. I also think the attitude that mental health provider was sharing was flatly contradicted by the research. Healthy spirituality is a great source of resiliency. That's not an opinion. That seems to be a fact based on the research as we have it today. Great question.
Thank you. Another question was, is there a registry for trauma-informed, sorry, I lost the question. Hold on. I'll give a different question. Oh yeah, is there a registry of referrals for trauma-informed religious leaders in different religions and states?
No, we're building this from the ground up. So Carrie Nettos, who's the chaplain in South Carolina, she has worked with every religious leader there. They provide training every single year. So she breaks bread a lot with the faith leaders in that community and really gets a sense of who gets it and who really is on board with trauma-informed spiritual care and coordinating that with the medical and mental health providers. So you're really gonna have to build it from ground up and provide education, just like that 2017 Tischelman-Fontes study said. We're going to have to educate those faith leaders because they probably didn't get it in seminary. Many of them didn't even go to seminary in non-denominational bodies. And so you're going to have to educate them, and then you're going to have to educate your mental health providers and somehow get them to work together. And I would also add this: you don't necessarily have to make a referral to someone in the child's faith tradition. They may not even want that. But you can have a mental health provider who is simply well-informed on the research, who has those 2 APA treatises on their shelf, who is qualified to work with a child on some of these issues. And then maybe only when you get to really detailed nuances, if a child has that, might you then be reaching out to a faith leader. So there's multiple ways to approach it. The only thing we can say today is we have to commit ourselves that the research is too large now. We can't ignore it. We have to move in this direction, and we have to figure out how to do it as sensitively as possible, and then to do as much research as we can on these new initiatives to make sure we are getting it right. But we're on the ground floor as a country.
Thank you. Well, kind of bouncing off of that, we don't have that registry, but is there the Zero Abuse Project have a guide for clergy and spiritual leaders that we can share to our investigators? Do you guys have some sort of packaged guide?
Yeah, maybe email me and we'll set up a time to talk privately, because I want to know more about the religious dynamics in your community, and then I can share the proper resources. So I mentioned my work with Sacred Spaces, and they have extraordinary resources if you're working within the Jewish community. I'm pretty good at most faith traditions and what package we send you of things to reach out to them. That book I've got a slide on, the child safeguarding book, that was written by Shira and Baziochevich. Baz is a former child abuse prosecutor, and Shira is a PhD psychologist and is really well versed on child abuse prevention. And it's just a great resource for the Christian community. And a Jewish version of that should be published in the next few months as well. And then I think Shira eventually, wants to develop a version of that that has appropriate language for other faith traditions as well. So there's some resources there, and there's more coming down the track.
Great, thank you. I'll do maybe 2 more questions and then we'll wrap it up. So do you have experience working with Muslim religious communities against child sexual abuse? Based on your experience, are there any special challenges that might be different from Christian religious communities?
Yeah, thanks for that. That is a faith tradition I've had the least involvement with. I am trying to grow my knowledge as much as I can, and I have read the portions of the Quran dealing with children and potential child abuse, and incorporate that into some of the presentations at Keeping Faith. However, I do know others that have worked more extensively in the Muslim community. So again, if you reach out to me, I can make a good referral.
Great. And I know you mentioned that it's okay to share your email. So when we email everybody the PowerPoint and the video, is it okay to include your email as well to reach out to you?
Yes, absolutely. I'm happy to work with you. I work for you, and happy to assist however we can.
Great. So we'll end with this question. This came earlier in the section. So what can we do and how can we intervene in abuse with a church elder or leader? Because as we know, many people in the church try to protect the church's dignity. So what about when it's a church leader?
I'm going to answer that, but one other point on the last question. On all the spiritual injury research I went through in this workshop, it was all done in the United States, and our religious demographics are largely Judeo-Christian, mostly Christian. And so there is some question, what nuances might there be if I'm working with a Muslim or a Hindu or somebody outside a Judeo-Christian tradition? And then another weakness of the research is clinicians often say, well, I see differences between a Catholic and a Lutheran and a Methodist and a conservative and a liberal theological construct. And so there's a lot still that researchers need to explore. There's still a lot we don't know, even though we certainly know a whole lot more than we did 25 years ago. On the issue of working with a elder that the church or the other religious community is protecting, I would start by asking ourselves, why is it that they're protecting that person? Dr. Shira Berkovitz wrote a great article that's online on the publication section under the Sacred Spaces website. And she says, we have to be aware of cognitive dissonance. We're all opposed to child abuse in the abstract. We're just not opposed to it when we see it. And the reason for that is it's usually then at the hands of somebody we know and care about and respect and even love. And so our brain says it's too painful for me to think of this guy as a child abuser. So I'm going to accept just about any story to excuse that conduct. And instead, I'm going to flood my brain with all the memories of how good and decent this person was and how he comforted me in the middle of the night when my mom died and so on and so forth. So Shira says, as part of our training to faith leaders, we have to educate them about cognitive dissonance and to teach them how to have checks and balances so that they will be less likely, less prone to rally around the offender than they have in the past. So that's the first thing, to understand why are they doing that, and to help them understand why they're doing that and see if you can get past that. And then beyond that, I think you just need to educate generally about the dynamics of abuse and how offenders like religion and how they take advantage of religion. I'm not saying an offender might not sincerely seek spiritual comfort. I'm just saying that we know from research a lot of them find it advantageous to operate inside a faith community. And so we need to educate those faith leaders at a very, very high level. Long term, we need to get into seminaries. We did a study of the course catalog of every accredited seminary in the United States, and we could only find 3% that had any training on child abuse, much less quality training. So one of the things we're working on is to try to get a seminary course on child abuse in every seminary in the country, and we're slowly getting there. We'll have our first seminary course up and running in the fall, and that's part of the long-term plan to work with these communities on. And then I guess the last point on that, always feel free to give me a call about a specific case so that we can talk through it at a higher level, and then on the specific facts of your case, maybe I can work with you to figure out a potential approach or two.
Yes, thank you so much. And just so you know, we will include Victor Vieth's contact information in the email you'll be getting within the next week with the recording and the PowerPoint. And I want to thank you so much. This was an excellent presentation. Thank you so much. And I want to also remind everyone to check out absac.org for future events, stuff about our online course, and information about the colloquia. And thank you so much, Victor.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, ABSAC. Thank you, Link Center.